Hey, and welcome to the Food Scene on heritageradionetwork.org. I'm your host, Michael Harlan Turkell, here today with a very special guest. I'm intimidated in a number of fashions and disciplines. I used to think I was a math major, and then now meeting you and reading your resume, it puts all that to shame. You know, I thought I was interested and involved in food sciences, then lugging around this book as well as Modernist Cuisine 1 through 5 and At Home, again, put to shame. People often call you an underachiever, jokingly, but you have so much more to achieve in your life. This is a constant interest, a constant source of inspiration for you, and I'm so excited that you're here to be able to talk about it from its impetus. Nathan Merville, thank you for being on Heritage Radio.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Brooklyn. We're in the two stevedore shipping containers as studio. It's an interesting place to be. It's not your cooking lab. It's not 20,000 square feet of equipment.
Well, actually, our cooking lab started off as the local Harley-Davidson service center, and we bought it and remodeled it into a lab. There still are guys who look like they walked out of a ZZ Top video coming up and saying, where do I get the hog serviced?
Have you ever thought about having that as a supplementary part of your business?
We probably could.
Yeah. So, I just want to show that you have humility. You were very humble in this, idea of modernist cuisine and cooking. And it all started from being a child fascinated by it. And at 13 years of age, apropos, we're at that time of season, you cook Thanksgiving for your family.
Nine years old. Yeah.
Again,
yeah.
Overachiever, underachiever. 9. Just tell me about that process, why you were interested in doing so and what you did.
So I grew up right beside a library. It was the Montana Avenue Branch Library in Santa Monica. And we were just 2 doors away. And I loved that library. And one day, I found the cookbook section. And this is because I was kind of methodically going through the library, okay? It was not... And the idea that people would tell you how you could make all this cool stuff. I already figured out I'd like to eat. But you could, actually do that stuff. It didn't, come from some other magic thing that was impossible to go do. So I told Mom I was going to cook Thanksgiving dinner. And I checked out a whole pile of books from the library, including Escoffier, which it turns out is not a great book for Thanksgiving. Okay, who knew? I went to the store by myself and bought everything, and then I cooked all by myself. I could do a better job today.
Yeah,
but I was sort of hooked on cooking from that point onward.
Was it cooking specifically, or was it that analytical, that logistical mind of yours? You like process?
Well, I always liked science from the time I was very little. There was a Doctor Who episode, the old black and white Doctor Who, I think it was the second Doctor, is stopped by someone. He says he's the doctor. He says, "Oh, Doctor, are you some kind of scientist?" And he says, "Sir, I'm every kind of scientist." I thought, God, how cool. Wouldn't it be cool to be every kind of scientist? And I'm never going to really be every kind of scientist, but it was a thought.
Yeah, but you're slowly taking them off. I mean, let's quickly go through school because, you did quickly go through school. Graduating high school at what age?
14.
College?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's degree in math. I got a master's degree in geophysics and space physics. Those are both at UCLA. Then I went to Princeton, and I got a master's degree in mathematical economics. Then I got a PhD in physics, also from Princeton.
And postdoc with whom?
Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, that's no small feat.
Yeah, so my thesis was about quantum field theory and curved space-time. And what I actually was trying to explain was where all matter in the universe came from. So it was small little questions like that I addressed.
Yeah. So where did it come from?
Well, actually...
We have plenty of time. Go ahead.
So you know that quantum mechanics works, and you know this because 1930s scientists figured this out, and quantum mechanics is essential to figuring out many things we experience in everyday life. If you look at a candle flame, The color of that candle flame is created by quantum phenomena in exciting various molecules that you're heating up. The fact that a street light, which has got sodium vapor in it, has a more yellow-greenish tinge than a fluorescent light, that's quantum mechanics, 100%. We also know gravity works. We know gravity works because we don't float off into space, and we can observe the Earth in the solar system and all these great dynamics of astronomy. Newton first figured out gravity at one level. Then in 1915, Albert Einstein figured out the general theory of relativity. Boy, your food listeners are wondering where this is going.
No, there's intent in why I asked that question.
So Einstein figured out what's called the general theory of relativity, which was his theory of how gravity works in extreme cases. Newtonian gravity works fine here on Earth, but if you make super massive things like a black hole, that's where Einsteinian gravity differs enormously from Newtonian gravity. Well, since the 1930s, people have tried to reconcile gravity, this spectacularly successful theory of Einstein from 1915, with quantum mechanics, which is a, say, 1930s invention, supplemented by many other discoveries all the way up to the present day. And no one's been able to really reconcile those two things. And if you understood how to reconcile those things, you would understand where the universe came from. You would understand the fundamental nature of space and time. You would understand why there is matter and why there is light. It's very profound questions that you ask if you're a cosmologist. And I was super attracted to that kind of stuff, so that was the sort of physics that I did. After getting a PhD at Princeton, I applied to postdocs. I applied to like 60 places because jobs were, even then, were very scarce. It hasn't actually improved that much. And I remember getting this phone call, and I heard this noise on the line. It was Stephen Hawking called me up. So immediately, I assume what anyone would assume, that my friends in graduate school were messing with me, okay? I figured this is like, bullshit, you're Stephen Hawking. This is literally what I say. And the next day, I got actually a telegram. Only telegram I've ever got in my life, and this shows what an old guy I am, okay? I don't think there's anyone in Bushwick who knows what a telegram is.
Oh, no, yeah, people are steampunk here. They revert back. They're anachronistic.
No, they may know what it is, okay, but they've never received one for real.
Nonetheless, from Stephen Hawking.
And I went to work with Stephen, and there's a parallel universe in which I became a chef. There's another parallel universe in which I stayed a physicist working for Stephen, but I was supposed to work with him for many years, but a whole series of things accidentally intervened. I took a leave of absence, it was supposed to be for 3 months, to work on a software project with a couple friends of mine from graduate school. Now this is 1983, so this is the origins of the software industry. There was only one public software company at the time, which no one who listens to this would remember. It was called Culinet, and it was a mainframe software company. Microsoft existed, but it had not gone public. None of these, the whole Silicon Valley thing had started with companies like Intel, Apple, but they're all hardware companies. There's no software. Certainly no internet. ARPANET and things like that existed, but at a very low level. And at the end of those 3 months, we'd incorporated a company around what we did. I was the CEO. I kept telling Stephen I was going to extend my leave of absence. Well, after running the company for a couple of years, we sold it to Microsoft. And many years later, it's announced that I'm leaving Microsoft or retiring. The next day, I get an email from Stephen. So, should we clean out the desk? Are you ready to come back?
Yeah. Well, I want to jump back to why you just explained all that to me and how it relates back to food. Because right now I have The Photography of Modernist Cuisine, a very large and impressive book, which follows Modernist Cuisine 1 through 5 and Modernist Cuisine at Home. And I've seen you speak a few times, and you say something very similar to a lot of chefs that have been in here. You have to understand the craft before the art, before you produce that, emotive, creative thing. And, just talking in theoretics or conceptual nature about the universe, you like understanding the macro, the micro, bits of everything before you build out. And that seems to have always been your path. We'll talk about Microsoft in a second, but it was leaving Microsoft, that impetus of wanting to go to culinary school, but not actually being able to, and spending time at Rovers in Seattle, which must have been transformative in how you thought about food. Can you tell me about...
Yeah, so I had been self-taught as a chef, amateur chef, but into lots of things. And at one point I said, maybe I should really get some... I'm so into this. I should, learn for real. And when I was interested in physics, I got a PhD at Princeton, so shouldn't I actually learn this stuff for real? And so I decided to go to a culinary school in France. Well, I was working for Bill Gates at the time. I was chief technology officer at Microsoft. And so I said, Bill, I want to take a leave of absence to go to chef school. And he laughed, and I said, no, really, really, I'm not joking. So I convinced him. Then I had to convince the chef school. So I applied, sent an application. I got this phone call back. Sir, would this be a change of career? I said, well, not really, just kind of a supplement. And they said, well, yes, we have these courses for amateurs. I said, no, I want the real deal thing. They said, well, you're not qualified. And so I said, well, come on, think about it. So they called me back. And they said, we will give you an oral examination on the phone. And I said, okay. So it lasted an hour, hour and a half, and they were asking me all of these questions. So one of them was, you're making a fish stock, a veal stock, and a chicken stock. How long do you cook each one? Well, I had read Escoffier cover to cover. I was completely into all of this stuff. And so I said, well, fish stock you cook for 20 minutes. A chicken stock you're going to cook for an hour, maybe 2, no more. And a veal stock you're not going to cook for less than 8. They're like, well, all right then. And it kept going on and on like it. How many times do you fold puff pastry? I mean, this thing. So I get every question right. So now they're like, So now we'll get back to you. So they got back to me and they said, well, you must apprentice in a great French restaurant. I said, okay. So there was a French restaurant in Seattle called Rovers. Chef Thierry Ratereau.
Who I love, by the way. Tom Douglas has been on, and they have a radio show out in Seattle, The Chef with the Hat.
Yeah. Terry is fantastic. In fact, I knew him before he had a hat. And I'd been an enthusiastic customer there. And so I said, hey, I want to come do this. And so Terry said yes. And I went one night a week, usually Wednesdays. I'd leave Microsoft at lunchtime and get in my chef's whites, and I'd drive over to Rovers, and I'd cook through service. So it would be from noon until 10. And this wound up being one night a week for about 2 years. Sometimes I was traveling, sometimes this. I wasn't always there. After a period of time, the people who worked for me at Microsoft got wind of this. And the first I knew that, I had worked on this dish and plated it up. And Terry was saying, you've got to plate this time. So fine, I played all of this. And then they come out, they said, table 6 is very offended. You screwed up their dinner. You have to go out there. Oh, shit. So I muster my courage, and I go out, talk to table 6. And, of course, it's all these people who work for me at Microsoft. And they're just messing with me. Everything was fine. But, in a French kitchen, you start off... it's a very hierarchical thing. It's a very old-school apprentice nature. Terry, the chef, started apprenticing when he was 14. That was how that whole system worked. And in the traditional days, and it's probably still to this day in many ways, there's two words you need to know in a French kitchen. You can actually work in a French kitchen without speaking French, so long as you know two words. Oui, chef. And in the classic French kitchen, the chef says something, you're looking at your shoes because you're not going to make eye contact. There's that dominance hierarchy deal. And then you're supposed to do it. And, of course, I'm much more of a why kind of a guy.
Yeah, asking why in a French kitchen.
And it's not that all French kitchens are that bad, but that was the general idea. It was a master-apprentice system.
Well, it also seems like you want to know the whole. And working in a French kitchen, going through the brigade system, it's compartmentalized. You
Yes.
start at garde manger and you work your way, to apps, to, being on the line. And it's hard to conceptualize a whole dish until you've worked your way through. So that why is what drives people, but to ask that in the French kitchen is almost taboo.
That's right. So anyway, I worked through the various stations at Rover's. Now, at the time, the restaurant kitchen was so small that you were never out of physical contact with somebody else. There was always somebody behind you, beside you, whatever. And in a funny way, that worked because you could never run into someone. You were already in physical contact. So when I say work the stations, it's not like, oh, yes, they were that department over there and this one over here. We were like right on top of each other. But you learn tons of things that almost no one bothers writing down. Because if you're in the apprentice system, that's how you learned it, and most of those people don't write books. And if you're outside the system, you never saw it. And that teaches you a lot of stuff in a very hands-on way. Much later, I was at this chef school in France, and it was the way that this school worked. They had restaurant chefs come in for a couple days at a time and do an intensive thing on something, and so we woke up one morning and we were supposed to bone ducks. And that's not like it sounds. This is basically you cut all of the flesh away and you unfold the thing. So although you can leave the leg bones in if you want, you've sort of turned the duck into like this glove that would otherwise fit on the skeleton. You have the whole skeleton taken out. Well, it happens I had boned a lot of ducks. And part of that was Rover's, part of that was I started making this turkey dish, actually for Thanksgiving, where you would bone the turkey first, which is great because you have this turkey that comes out and you can like slice all the way through it, and like it freaks people out. So we start working. I'm like going to town, and the chef stops me. He says, You there! Who taught you this? And before I could answer, he says, You know a duck like a Frenchman. So that was what I learned in that apprentice, and that's how you have to learn that.
So modernist cuisine. Prior to that, there was Nouvelle cuisine. And let's talk about that a little bit first, because what modern cuisine is a departure from tableside service. There's composure in the kitchen, the chef actually plating the dish. And again, these things weren't brought to the forefront. What the photography of modernist cuisine actually does is show the skeletal nature of food, the microscopic, the biology of food visually. And that wasn't something that you saw because things were cooked in the kitchen and then plated at the table.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point. That it's very tempting when you grow up with something, you think that's the way it always was. People who grow up today think that the internet was always there, because it was always there for them. And they're sort of dimly aware that there was this point, maybe Thomas Edison's era, where they didn't really have the internet. But most of the things of dining that we are familiar with were recent inventions. So no fine restaurant ever sent food out on a plate. It's almost impossible to believe. If you think about eating in a fine restaurant today, of course food comes out on a plate. Of course it's already plated. But no, at a fine restaurant, the original idea was trolleys would come out, meat would be carved at the table, big platters of vegetables would come out, and the waiter would put everything on the plate, and they'd ask you, "Hey, you want some mashed potatoes?" Whack, you want a little bit more? You want a little bit more white meat or dark meat? That kind of tableside service, which was a direct extension of what aristocrats ate. Okay, so if you watch Downton Abbey, Downton Abbey, although that was a 20th century show, that style of being served is the way monarchs had been served for the previous couple hundred years. The first real restaurants that were fine restaurants happened around the time of the French Revolution, because all the fancy aristocrats got their heads cut off, and so the chef said, oh shit, what are we going to do? So let's set up shop and serve other people. And they served other people the way the aristocrats had been served, with this Downton Abbey formal dining service sort of deal. And it was in the 1960s that the Trois Gros brothers, at their great restaurant in southwest France, said, no, screw this. We're going to put stuff on in the kitchen, because that way the chef can control the plate. That way we can garnish. That way we can do all these things. And you try to imagine what going to an interesting restaurant would be like if the chefs couldn't control what was on the plate. And that's just one example. But all of this French fine cuisine is codified in 1903 by this guy, Auguste Escoffier. And he wrote the great manual, which then not only swept France, but the whole rest of the world. That book is the single main reason that fine dining anywhere on earth kind of meant French dining, for the next 100 or so years. And although he was kind of a radical himself, Escoffier, what he wound up doing was codifying something that made a very stultifying set of rules. Okay, so by the late 1950s, there's a few guys that are itching to be revolutionaries. And probably the single most important one is a guy named Fernand Point. Weighed 300 pounds at least. Very charismatic guy. Looks just like the fat French chef, if you called central casting and say, give me... That was this guy. And he wound up, because he weighed 300 pounds, he died young, unfortunately. But his kitchen started messing with these rules. And then he trained a whole set of other chefs that went out. And by the 1960s, there was a grassroots revolution going on in French cuisine, where these guys were breaking the rules. And a few food critics started supporting it, and it was called Nouvelle Cuisine. Now, in art, this phenomenon had happened a long time ago, right? In the late 19th century, you started having the French Impressionists. You started having modern architecture, modern literature, philosophy. Every aesthetic part of society went through a modernist revolution. In fine dining, particularly in a French context, Nouvelle was like that. And not only did it revolutionize French cuisine, it became a model of revolution for others. Now, the same thing happens around the world. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, that caused a whole change to where all these monarchies wound up as either being republics or constitutional monarchies where they told the king or queen, yeah, you can hang around, but we're electing everyone. So Nouvelle Cuisine in France, not only does it change French cuisine, but it inspires a whole set of American chefs to say, you know something, we can break our rules too. Sometimes they were inspired directly by France, sometimes indirectly, but you have this great revolution occur. But then a funny thing happens. There's this great song by The Who that has a phrase, meet the old boss, same as the new boss. Many revolutions wind up getting captured and becoming not the ideals of the revolution, but they become simply a replacement. That the great ideals are betrayed by the guy that becomes the dictator. So the Nouvelle Cuisine pretty rapidly elevated a whole generation of French chefs to being the top dogs in France. And then they stopped innovating. They became as stultifying a set of rules as had existed before. It was a very funny transition. In fact, there was a great 10 Commandments of Nouvelle Cuisine that was put out by French food critics. And one of the specific, many of them are quaint to look at today. Like one of them was, for a bunch of weird reasons at the time, they were like against pickled vegetables. And So one of their great intellectual principles was hold the pickles. I'm not kidding at all. But another one of these great principles was don't be explicitly modernist. You can revolt, but only revolt to a small degree. You can hold the pickles. You can get the starch out of sauces. That was another one. No more flour-thickened sauces. Ooh, that's radical. When those chefs, some of the chefs in this movement, started going beyond that, they were shouted down. Alain Sonderans, one of the great Nouvelle chefs, served a dish where he used soy sauce in it. It caused an outrage. He was excoriated in the pages of Le Figaro. That wasn't French. So around that time, some other chefs around the world sort of picked up the banner of revolution where they had stopped. And one of the earliest was a guy named Ferran Adria. He starts at a dishwasher at a restaurant that was a bar and grill attached to a miniature golf course in a very minor seaside resort in Spain near the French border. So here he is at a miniature golf course, for Christ's sake. It's the least auspicious beginning you could imagine. And his greatest desire is to be like these Nouvelle Cuisine guys. So he studies them, he goes and eats at their restaurants, he's working, and he's innovating, and he like pulls up to them, and he pulls up alongside them right about the time that they stopped innovating. And he just kept going. And so what I call is a long beginning to what I call the modernist revolution in food is this idea of modernism that we saw in art and architecture and photography and poetry, philosophy, where you take in a modern point of view. And a key element of that is to say, screw rules. Let's color outside the box. Let's do things which are great, irrespective of what the old guard thinks of us.
But still understanding those rules. Because do you consider yourself a radical? Because I think what modernist cuisine does is actually give people an idea of what they're doing rather than...
Well, so that's part of the modern ideal. Okay, so I learned at Rovers and then in this French culinary school, I learned in the apprentice system. And I did learn all of those basics. But as a guy who loves science and inquiry and transparency, I did want to ask why. So after I retired from Microsoft, I started cooking a lot, and I got more and more into... I had been aware of Adria and this whole modernist thing going on, and I kind of naively said, okay, great, I'm going to go find the big book. I'm going to go buy the big book that'll teach me all this stuff. And Harold McGee in 1983 had come out with a book called On Food and Cooking, which was sort of a prelude, but it's a book that doesn't have any recipes. So it wasn't the manual, but it was the intellectual inspiration to say, you know something, science has something to teach the kitchen. So I'm looking for this big book, and I don't find it. Then another thing happened, which without this I never would have done the books. I discover this internet forum called eGullet. And it had this amazing set of people on it. It had housewives from the rural Midwest. It had people from the great kitchens all over the world. It had folks in hundreds of countries, all driven there as a place where they could discuss all sorts of things. And so I started a thread there on sous vide, which was one of these techniques, and say, hey, the original title of the thread was Sous Vide Recipes Wanted. And I said, hey, I want to get some recipes and get some intuitive understanding of how sous vide works. And I'd already bought every book on sous vide at the time, which was like 3, and they were all in French, and they were all oriented around industrial food service. So it was like completely not what I wanted. And what I discovered is this big book I was looking for did not exist. this big book, and I don't find it. Then another thing.